Your soulmate wrote a letter with your name on it years ago. Here's why it stayed hidden, and before your mind tries to turn this into a romantic fantasy or a literal piece of paper locked in a drawer, slow down and stay with this message, because what God is revealing here is far deeper, more emotional, and more intentional than most people ever realize. This letter was never just ink and paper, it was intention, feeling, and truth formed in a moment when your soulmate already sensed your presence in their life long before timing, circumstances, or readiness allowed the connection to exist openly. Listen carefully now, because some souls recognize each other before the world allows them to meet properly, and that recognition doesn't always arrive as clarity, it often arrives as emotion without explanation. Years ago, your soulmate felt something they couldn't name, a pull they couldn't justify, a sense of connection they couldn't act on, and in that space of confusion and honesty, the letter was formed, not necessarily written out, but emotionally composed, filled with words they wished they could say, promises they weren't ready to keep yet, and truths they didn't yet have the courage or stability to live out. Stay present, because this is where many people misunderstand divine timing. They think delay means denial, but God delays to protect what is real from being destroyed by immaturity, fear, or unhealed wounds. The reason the letter stayed hidden is not because your soulmate forgot you, it's because they knew, consciously or unconsciously, that the version of themselves back then could not yet love you the way they wanted to, the way you deserved. Pay attention here, because this letter wasn't hidden out of neglect, it was hidden out of reverence. Reverence for something that felt sacred but unfinished. Your soulmate may have been younger emotionally, still shaped by survival, still carrying patterns of fear, instability, or confusion, and even though their heart already knew your name, their life wasn't aligned enough to speak it out loud without damaging the connection before it could begin. Don't skip this, because this is the part where destiny and free will intersect. God does not force souls together when one or both are unprepared. He allows recognition, then waits for transformation. That waiting is why the letter stayed hidden. Your soulmate carried it through seasons of growth, mistakes, other relationships, disappointments, and lessons, not as a reminder of what they lost, but as a quiet symbol of what they were becoming. The letter stayed hidden because life had to shape them into someone capable of honoring it. Listen closely, because there were moments when they almost revealed it, moments when they felt close to reaching out, close to saying something vulnerable, close to choosing truth, but fear, timing, and responsibility held them back. And God allowed that restraint, because premature honesty can be just as harmful as dishonesty when hearts are not ready to hold what's revealed. Stay with this message, because your soulmate didn't hide the letter to deceive you, they hid it to protect both of you from a connection that would have been incomplete back then. Back then, love might have felt intense but unstable, passionate but unsustainable, real but unsafe. God does not allow real love to begin in unsafe conditions if it's meant to last. So the letter waited. It waited through their growth. It waited through your growth too. Because while your soulmate was becoming ready, so were you. You were learning boundaries, self-worth, discernment, and strength, things you didn't yet have years ago either. That's why the timing didn't align then. Two souls can recognize each other early, but recognition is not permission. God gives permission only when both hearts can stand in truth without losing themselves. Pay attention now, because the letter staying hidden also protected the purity of its intention. Once words are spoken, they create expectation. Once promises are made, they create responsibility. Your soulmate knew that making promises before they could keep them would turn love into guilt, pressure, or regret. So they chose silence over false assurance. Silence is often misunderstood, but in this case, it was an act of integrity. Listen carefully, because your soulmate revisited that letter many times internally, refining it, changing it, removing ego, removing fantasy, removing immaturity, until what remained was not obsession, not longing, but readiness. The letter matured as they matured. That's why it couldn't be shared years ago. It wasn't finished yet. And neither were they. Stay present, because God was involved in the hiding. God protects seeds before they grow. He buries them, not to kill them, but to give them the conditions to develop roots strong enough to support what will eventually rise. This letter was a seed. And seeds are not displayed, they are planted in darkness first. Years passed because roots were forming. Character was forming. Discernment was forming. Your soulmate was learning what love actually requires beyond feelings. And you were learning what love should never require you to tolerate. Don't miss this, because the reason the letter is being revealed now is not nostalgia, it's alignment. The conditions that once made the letter dangerous to reveal no longer exist. Fear no longer dominates. Immaturity no longer leads. Confusion no longer controls. Both souls are steadier now. And when steadiness arrives, truth can safely come into the light. Listen closely, because the letter doesn't demand anything from you now. It doesn't say you must return feelings or rewrite the past. It exists to explain why something always felt unfinished, why certain connections couldn't be replaced, why certain lessons kept pointing back to growth instead of closure. The letter stayed hidden because its purpose wasn't to begin a relationship back then, it was to preserve the possibility of one later, whether with each other or simply as a healed understanding that freed both hearts. Stay with this, because sometimes the purpose of a soulmate is not to arrive early, but to arrive correctly. And correctness requires patience. The letter stayed hidden because it was waiting for a version of love that wasn't desperate, reactive, or incomplete. It was waiting for love that could stand in daylight without shame, fear, or confusion. And that kind of love only emerges after years of inner work, mistakes, and surrender. Pay attention now, because whether this letter ever becomes spoken words or remains a quiet knowing between souls, its purpose is already being fulfilled. It has taught patience. It has taught growth. It has taught discernment. And most importantly, it has taught that real love is not rushed, not forced, and not wasted. The fact that it stayed hidden is not a tragedy. It is proof that God was protecting something real until the moment it could exist without breaking either heart. This is part one of that truth, the understanding that what was hidden was not forgotten, what was delayed was not denied, and what was written years ago was never meant to be read until now, when both souls are finally strong enough to understand why it had to wait. There is another layer to this story that only becomes visible once you understand why the letter stayed hidden, because hiding was not the end of the process, it was the middle of it, and what happened during those silent years is what gave the letter its weight, its truth, and its timing. Your soulmate didn't simply tuck the letter away and forget it existed, they carried it internally through seasons that reshaped who they were, through choices that taught them what love is and what it is not, through losses that stripped away illusion and left only what was real. During those years, the letter became a mirror rather than a message, reflecting back to them the gap between who they were and who they needed to become to honor what they felt. This is why God allowed time to stretch the way it did, because time is not just a delay, it is a teacher, and your soulmate needed to learn lessons that could not be rushed without damaging the very thing they hoped to protect. As life unfolded, there were moments when they almost convinced themselves the letter was just imagination, a projection, a symbol of longing rather than destiny, and yet every time they tried to bury it emotionally, it resurfaced in a different form, as comparison, as dissatisfaction, as a quiet knowing that something deeper still waited ahead. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. God was using contrast to refine discernment. Every connection your soulmate experienced after that initial recognition served as a filter, revealing what was missing, what felt hollow, what could not sustain the soul long term. And with each realization, the letter became less about fantasy and more about truth. It shed its idealism. It shed its urgency. It shed its romantic exaggeration. What remained was intention rooted in clarity. That process takes years because clarity cannot exist where fear still governs choices. During this time, your soulmate also watched you from afar in ways you may never have known, not always literally, but intuitively, sensing your growth, your shifts, your boundaries forming, your tolerance for confusion fading. They knew, again not always consciously, that the version of you emerging would not accept the kind of love they once could have offered. And instead of resenting that, it humbled them. It showed them that love is not about possession, but about alignment. This is why the letter stayed hidden even when opportunities to reveal it appeared. Revealing it too soon would have asked you to meet them where they were, rather than where you were meant to be. God does not allow that kind of imbalance to begin a connection meant to be sacred. Silence, in this case, was not absence, it was restraint guided by wisdom forming slowly through lived experience. Over time, your soulmate began to understand that love is not proven by intensity, but by consistency, not by words spoken in emotional moments, but by character sustained over ordinary days. This realization transformed the letter. It stopped being about what they wanted from you and became about what they were willing to become for love, whether with you or simply within themselves. That shift is crucial, because love that demands is immature, but love that prepares is ready. God allowed the letter to stay hidden while this shift took place because once love matures to that level, it no longer needs to announce itself loudly. It waits for alignment rather than forcing opportunity. Your soulmate also had to confront their own fears during this time, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of disrupting peace, fear of realizing too late that timing matters more than feeling. Those fears didn't disappear overnight. They were dismantled slowly through experience, through failure, through prayer, through surrender. And as fear loosened its grip, something else grew in its place: responsibility. Responsibility not to confess feelings just to relieve emotional pressure, responsibility not to burden another soul with unfinished self-work, responsibility to ensure that if words were ever spoken, they would not need to be taken back or explained away later. That responsibility is why the letter stayed hidden even when longing resurfaced. Your soulmate learned that longing is not permission. Desire is not direction. God teaches that love must be guided, not driven. During these years, your own journey mattered just as much. You were shedding old patterns, learning to trust yourself, developing discernment that would not have existed back then. The you of years ago may have romanticized struggle or interpreted silence as challenge, but the you of now recognizes peace as clarity and consistency as care. God was aligning two timelines that needed to mature independently before they could ever intersect honestly. The hidden letter existed as a placeholder during that alignment, a reminder not of what was missing, but of what was coming into form slowly and deliberately. This is also why the letter does not come with guilt or regret now. Regret would imply wasted time. God wastes nothing. Every delay served purpose. Every silence built foundation. Every redirection protected something fragile from being mishandled. The letter stayed hidden because it was never meant to be an interruption, it was meant to be a confirmation when the time was right. And now, the reason it is surfacing is not because something must be done immediately, but because something must be understood. Understanding closes loops that action alone cannot. Your soulmate needed to understand why waiting was not failure, why restraint was not cowardice, why silence was not abandonment. And you needed to understand why certain connections never fully left your spirit, not because you were meant to cling to the past, but because the past was shaping discernment for the future. The letter is revealing itself now to release both of you from misunderstanding. It explains without demanding. It clarifies without controlling. It honors without attaching expectation. That is the mark of something divinely guided. Whether the words of the letter are ever spoken aloud matters less than the truth it carries now. That recognition happened early, readiness came later, and timing was never working against love, it was working for it. The letter stayed hidden because God was protecting not just a connection, but two lives from colliding before they could meet in strength instead of need. Now that strength exists. Now that peace exists. Now that discernment exists. The letter no longer needs to remain buried, because its purpose has shifted from preservation to understanding. And understanding is what allows hearts to move forward without confusion, without regret, and without fear, whether forward together or forward with peace. What becomes clear now is that the letter did more than wait, it shaped the inner architecture of your soulmate in ways neither of you could have predicted at the time, because hidden things don't stay inactive, they mature in silence, and that maturation is what made this moment inevitable rather than accidental. During the years the letter remained unspoken, your soulmate was being confronted again and again with the gap between intention and embodiment, between what they felt in their heart and what their life was actually capable of sustaining. Each season tested that gap. Some seasons tempted them to abandon the letter entirely, to convince themselves it was only a projection or a symbol of youthful longing. Other seasons tempted them to reveal it prematurely, driven by loneliness, nostalgia, or fear that time might erase the opportunity. Yet every time those impulses rose, something deeper restrained them, not repression, but discernment that was still forming. God was teaching them restraint as an act of love, not as avoidance. They learned that speaking truth before it can be lived fractures trust, even when intentions are pure. As time passed, the letter became less about you as a person they imagined and more about the standard of love they were being shaped to meet. It quietly corrected them. When they were tempted to settle for convenience, the letter reminded them that depth requires patience. When they were tempted to chase intensity, it reminded them that intensity without stability collapses. When they were tempted to perform love instead of practice it, the letter exposed the difference. This is why the letter survived seasons that erased other attachments. It wasn't fueled by fantasy, it was anchored in a call toward becoming. And becoming is slow. Your soulmate had to face parts of themselves that were incompatible with the love they sensed. Patterns of avoidance. Inconsistency masked as independence. Fear disguised as logic. Ego framed as self-respect. Each layer had to be confronted honestly, and none of that could happen quickly without bypassing truth. God allowed life to apply pressure because pressure reveals what intention alone cannot. Under that pressure, the letter changed tone internally. What may have once been full of emotion softened into clarity. What may have once sounded like longing matured into responsibility. What may have once imagined rescue transformed into partnership. This inner rewriting mattered more than any external expression ever could. At the same time, you were undergoing your own refinement, even if you didn't know the letter existed. You were learning to distinguish between love that costs you your peace and love that protects it. You were learning that chemistry is not commitment and that availability matters more than potential. You were learning to trust your intuition instead of overriding it for the sake of connection. These lessons were not separate from your soulmate's journey, they were parallel. God often grows souls in parallel long before they are allowed to intersect, because intersection without alignment creates damage instead of destiny. The hidden letter functioned as a tether during this parallel growth, not pulling either of you backward, but preventing premature attachment from hijacking the process. There were moments when circumstances might have allowed a meeting, a message, or a confession, but alignment was still incomplete. And God values alignment more than opportunity. Opportunity without alignment creates stories that feel intense but end in regret. Alignment creates stories that feel calm but endure. As your soulmate matured, they also had to confront a difficult truth, that loving someone correctly sometimes means not choosing them until you can do so without causing harm. This is one of the most misunderstood expressions of love. Silence is often judged as indifference, but there is a silence born of responsibility, a silence that refuses to offer half-formed promises. That silence is costly. It requires sitting with longing without relief, with uncertainty without reassurance, with hope without outcome. Your soulmate carried that cost quietly, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they respected the weight of what they felt. Over time, that respect transformed into peace. Peace didn't erase the letter. It purified it. The letter no longer needed to ask for anything. It no longer needed to prove itself. It became a truth that could exist without demanding response. That is when God begins to move it toward the light, because truth that no longer needs validation is safe to reveal. The revealing now is not about creating a romantic turning point or forcing a narrative. It is about restoring coherence. When something meaningful stays hidden too long, it can create distortion, confusion, or self-doubt on both sides. God reveals not to reopen wounds, but to heal the misunderstanding that silence can create. The letter explains without binding. It clarifies without claiming. It offers understanding without obligation. This is why its emergence now feels calm rather than dramatic. Drama belongs to attachment. Peace belongs to alignment. Your soulmate is now able to hold the truth of the letter without needing it to define their worth or dictate their future. That alone signals completion. Completion doesn't always look like reunion or confession. Sometimes it looks like clarity that releases both people from carrying questions they could never answer on their own. The letter stayed hidden until it could be revealed without destabilizing either life. That was the condition. God does not reveal truth if it will destroy more than it heals. Now, it heals. It heals the narrative of why things didn't happen sooner. It heals the self-blame that whispers something was missed or mishandled. It heals the illusion that timing was an enemy. Timing was the architect. The letter's existence proves that recognition can precede readiness without being wasted. It proves that love can be real even when it is restrained. It proves that God's delays are not punishments but protections that mature intention into integrity. Whether the letter ever becomes shared words or remains an internal knowing, its purpose has already been fulfilled by bringing understanding to where there was once ambiguity. And understanding is what allows both souls to move forward unburdened, no longer asking, "What if," but grounded in, "This is why." The hidden letter did not steal years from either of you, it gave those years meaning. It ensured that when truth surfaced, it would do so without urgency, without confusion, and without fear. That is how you know it was guided. What unfolds next is the quiet resolution that only arrives when something hidden has finished shaping everyone it was meant to shape, because the purpose of the letter was never just about being written, or even about being revealed, it was about completing a cycle of growth that neither of you could rush without losing yourselves in the process. By the time the letter is ready to be acknowledged now, its role has changed. It is no longer a question mark hanging over the past, it is a period that completes a sentence you both have been living out separately for years. Your soulmate is no longer carrying the letter as a source of longing or restraint, but as a witness to their transformation, proof that they did not betray their own truth even when they chose patience over impulse. This is important to understand, because many people think love is proven by action alone, but some of the deepest love is proven by what someone refuses to do before they are ready to do it right. Your soulmate refused to turn a sacred feeling into a coping mechanism, refused to use you as an answer to their own unfinished healing, refused to make promises their life could not yet sustain, and those refusals shaped them into someone capable of love that is steady rather than consuming. Over time, the letter stopped representing a future they were waiting for and started representing an inner alignment they were becoming, a compass that quietly pointed them back to integrity whenever fear, loneliness, or ego tempted them to settle or rush. This is why the letter did not fade even as years passed, because it was not anchored to circumstance, it was anchored to values that were still forming. At the same time, your own life was unfolding in ways that made you less willing to accept anything that felt unclear, inconsistent, or emotionally unsafe, and although you may not have known it, the hidden letter was protecting you from being pulled into something that would have demanded versions of you that no longer exist. God was working on both sides of the silence, not to keep you apart indefinitely, but to make sure that if understanding ever arrived, it would arrive without destabilizing the lives you had built. This is why the letter emerges now not as a call to action, but as a moment of clarity, because clarity is what closes loops without reopening wounds. Your soulmate can now look back at the years the letter stayed hidden without regret, because they can see the coherence in the journey, how each delay prevented damage, how each unanswered moment forced growth, how each redirected path added depth instead of loss. They understand now that love is not diminished by waiting when waiting is guided by responsibility, and that truth carries more weight when it has been tested by time rather than rushed by emotion. This understanding changes how they hold the connection itself, not as something unfinished or unresolved, but as something that served its purpose exactly as it was meant to. The letter no longer asks for a response, it offers explanation, and explanation is often the most healing gift because it restores meaning where silence once created confusion. For you, This stage brings a similar sense of release, because understanding allows you to stop questioning your intuition, to stop wondering why certain connections never fully left your spirit, to stop blaming yourself for timing that was never yours to control. You can see now that what felt like absence was actually alignment being built in the background, and that realization frees you from carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be permanent. God reveals the letter now not to bind you to a specific outcome, but to restore trust in the process that guided both of you through separate transformations without losing what mattered. This is where many people expect a dramatic turning point, a confession, a reunion, or a decisive ending, but divine closure rarely looks dramatic. It looks peaceful, grounded, and complete. Completion does not always mean togetherness, it means nothing is left unresolved inside the heart. The letter's final purpose is not to pull either of you backward into what might have been, but to allow both of you to move forward without carrying unspoken questions or misinterpreted silence. Your soulmate no longer needs to protect the letter by hiding it, because its truth can now exist without creating imbalance, pressure, or expectation. You no longer need to search for meaning in past moments, because the meaning has revealed itself gently and fully. God does not close chapters by erasing them, He closes them by explaining them in a way that leaves no residue of doubt. This explanation is the closing grace. It tells you that recognition happened early because souls often sense alignment before life can support it, that readiness came later because readiness requires experience, healing, and maturity, and that timing was never withholding love, it was refining it. Whether this understanding leads to communication, reconnection, or simply inner peace is not something that needs to be forced, because the letter has already done its work by restoring clarity and dissolving the illusion that something was lost. Nothing was lost. Everything was preserved until it could be held without harm. This is the quiet ending that feels like relief rather than loss, like coherence rather than confusion, like trust restored rather than questions answered. The letter stayed hidden because it needed time to become truth rather than fantasy, and now that it has emerged, it no longer needs to be protected, because both hearts are strong enough to understand it without being controlled by it. This is how divine timing completes its work, not by giving you everything you imagined, but by giving you understanding that allows you to stand firmly in the present without being pulled by the past or anxious about the future. The story of the hidden letter does not end in longing, it ends in peace, and peace is how you know the purpose has been fulfilled. What remains now is not anticipation, not tension, and not even longing, but integration, because the final work of the hidden letter was never about what would happen next between two people, it was about what would finally settle inside both hearts once truth was fully understood. At this stage, the letter is no longer something your soulmate carries as a private weight or a sacred secret, it has transformed into wisdom, and wisdom doesn't cling, it clarifies. Your soulmate can now hold the memory of what was written, felt, and restrained without it stirring restlessness or regret, because the purpose of restraint has been fulfilled. They understand now that the letter was never meant to bind the future, it was meant to shape the present into something honest and grounded. This understanding has altered how they relate to love itself, because once someone learns that patience can be an act of devotion, they stop confusing urgency with sincerity. The years of silence no longer feel like something missing, they feel like something completed. That shift matters, because it releases both of you from the illusion that something precious slipped through your fingers. Nothing slipped away. It was held carefully until it could no longer be mishandled by fear, immaturity, or projection. Your soulmate no longer needs to revisit the letter internally to remind themselves of who they are becoming, because they have already become that person. The letter did its work quietly, shaping their values, strengthening their discernment, and teaching them that love worthy of longevity must be lived before it is spoken. That lesson is now embodied, not just understood. For you, this final stage brings a similar embodiment, a sense that your intuition was never wrong, only early. You no longer need to replay moments wondering if you imagined depth where none existed, because the emergence of understanding confirms that what you felt was real, just not ready. This confirmation restores trust in yourself, which is one of the most healing outcomes possible. You can now release the habit of questioning your instincts or doubting your perception, because the clarity arriving now shows that timing, not misjudgment, was the missing piece. God allows this clarity at the end so neither soul walks forward carrying confusion disguised as memory. The letter's final role is not to reopen connection, but to close misunderstanding. It explains why things unfolded the way they did without assigning blame or creating obligation. It allows both hearts to breathe again without feeling pulled backward or pushed forward. That is divine closure. Divine closure does not demand decisions, it dissolves inner conflict so decisions, if they ever come, arise from peace rather than pressure. Your soulmate no longer feels defined by what they withheld, because they can see that withholding was part of honoring truth rather than avoiding it. They did not abandon love, they protected it until it could stand without collapsing. That realization frees them from self-judgment and allows gratitude to replace self-doubt. Gratitude for growth. Gratitude for patience. Gratitude for a process that demanded integrity rather than impulse. And gratitude is how stories end without bitterness. On your side, the understanding brings a gentle sense of completion as well. You no longer need to search for meaning in silence or interpret absence as lack of care. You can see now that silence sometimes exists because words would have asked too much too soon. That awareness restores emotional balance, because it removes the sting from unanswered moments and replaces it with coherence. God reveals the full picture only when it can be received without destabilizing the present. This is why the letter emerges now, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet assurance that nothing meaningful was wasted. The past served the future by shaping discernment, not by creating attachment. The hidden letter was not a promise waiting to be fulfilled, it was a truth waiting to be understood. Now that understanding has arrived, the heart can release the need to hold on to the symbol itself. Symbols lose their grip once their lesson is learned. What remains is not longing, but peace. Peace that does not need explanation. Peace that does not depend on outcome. Peace that allows both souls to move forward without emotional residue. Whether your paths cross again or diverge permanently becomes secondary, because the primary work has already been done internally. The letter has fulfilled its purpose by restoring clarity, dignity, and self-trust. It has closed the loop without forcing a narrative. It has honored the connection without trapping either person in it. This is the kind of ending that doesn't feel like loss, because nothing is taken away, only misunderstanding. God's timing reveals that some things are hidden not to create mystery, but to allow maturation. When something emerges too early, it becomes burden. When it emerges at the right time, it becomes wisdom. The letter is wisdom now. Wisdom does not demand attention, it simply informs how you live next. Both of you are freer because of it, freer to choose without fear, freer to love without projection, freer to recognize alignment when it appears without confusing it for intensity. This freedom is the true gift of the hidden letter. Not reunion. Not confession. But clarity that allows peace to settle permanently. That is how divine stories conclude, not with spectacle, but with quiet alignment that leaves nothing unresolved inside the heart. What finally unfolds now is not another revelation layered on top of the last, but the settling of everything into lived truth, because the deepest work of the hidden letter was never about explanation alone, it was about transformation that continues even after understanding arrives. At this stage, neither you nor your soulmate are standing at the edge of a question anymore, you are standing in the aftermath of clarity, where the soul is no longer searching for meaning but learning how to live with it peacefully. The letter, once hidden, once heavy with restraint and timing, no longer occupies a specific place in your soulmate's inner world as something separate from who they are. It has dissolved into character, into discernment, into a quiet confidence that no longer needs symbols to remember what matters. This is important, because when something has truly completed its purpose, it stops asking to be revisited. It becomes part of how a person moves forward. Your soulmate no longer wonders what would have happened if the letter had been revealed earlier, because they can see clearly now that earlier versions of themselves could not have carried the responsibility that truth requires. Responsibility is not about obligation to another person, it is about the ability to stand in honesty without collapsing under it. That ability was built slowly, deliberately, through years that may have felt empty at times but were actually full of unseen work. In those years, your soulmate learned how to be alone without becoming bitter, how to desire without grasping, how to feel deeply without acting impulsively. These lessons were not accidental. They were the conditions God required before allowing the truth to surface. And now that it has surfaced, it no longer creates disturbance, only coherence. For you, this stage brings a similar embodiment. You are no longer interpreting signs, replaying memories, or trying to decode silence. The understanding you now carry has stabilized your emotional landscape. You can look back without longing pulling you off balance and look forward without fear pushing you into urgency. That balance is the sign that the work is complete. The hidden letter no longer represents something unfinished, it represents something honored. Honor does not bind. It frees. God does not reveal truth so that people cling to it, He reveals truth so that people can stop clinging. This is the paradox of divine timing. What is revealed at the right time no longer needs to be held tightly, because it does not threaten loss. The letter's final role is not to connect two people externally, but to integrate truth internally so that neither of you carry distortion into future relationships, decisions, or self-perception. Your soulmate can now love without using restraint as armor, because restraint has done its work. They no longer need silence to protect integrity, because integrity has become part of who they are. That is growth you cannot rush. That is maturity you cannot fake. On your side, the clarity allows you to trust peace without questioning it, to recognize alignment without anxiety, to walk away from anything that resembles the old patterns without needing dramatic justification. You are no longer trying to prove that what you felt was real. Reality has already confirmed it through understanding. God allowed the letter to remain hidden until neither of you needed it to validate your worth or define your future. Now it exists as a completed chapter, not a loose thread. This is why there is no urgency attached to it now. Urgency belongs to insecurity. Completion brings calm. If your paths cross again, they will do so from wholeness, not from unfinished business. If they do not, the understanding still stands, unshaken, because it was never meant to guarantee an outcome, only to restore truth. This is what many people misunderstand about soulmate narratives. A soulmate is not always someone who stays forever in your life. Sometimes a soulmate is someone who shapes you forever so that you can love better, choose wiser, and live more honestly. The hidden letter fulfilled that role perfectly. It shaped patience. It refined intention. It prevented premature attachment from turning into regret. It allowed love to be honored without being mishandled. And now, its final gift is peace that does not depend on proximity, communication, or future promise. That peace is durable. It does not erode when circumstances change. It does not panic when answers are not immediate. It does not cling to symbols or stories. It simply rests. God brings stories to this kind of ending when the lesson has been fully absorbed. Nothing more needs to be said. Nothing needs to be proven. Nothing needs to be recovered. The past has been integrated, the present is grounded, and the future is no longer burdened by questions that never belonged there. The hidden letter has completed its journey, from intention, to restraint, to understanding, to wisdom. And wisdom does not ask for attention. It quietly informs every choice that comes next. This is how divine processes conclude, not with spectacle, but with stability that allows life to move forward cleanly, without emotional residue, without confusion, and without fear.